So, for our first roundtable, forestry initiatives have emerged as a promising avenue not only for enhancing natural carbon sequestration, but also for generating new revenue streams through the sale of carbon offsets in voluntary markets. Practice-based programs offer compensation to landowners for implementing active management strategies that boost forest health and, in turn, carbon sequestration. However, accessibility to these programs have been hampered to small landowners struggling to navigate monitoring, reporting, and verification and other carbon market requirements. Our first roundtable will examine some of these requirements and explore ways to bolster MRV for forest carbon offsets. It is my pleasure to introduce David Ford, Principal at LNC Carbon, to moderate the session. David?
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is David Ford, and I will moderate our panel today. And we're going to focus on forest for our first set of discussions. But before I introduce our topic and panelists, I want to thank Governor Kotek for hosting this workshop. She's been a leader in setting climate mitigation goals, creating policy, and working with our legislature to establish statutes and funding to facilitate action in both the public and the private sectors. Now, through the work of the Oregon Climate Action Commission, of which I'm a voting member and representing the forestry community in that work, we put in place a strategy to recognize and direct funding to natural and working lands as they are key to climate mitigation and the significant opportunity there. Just a few words about me. I'm a forester with, hard to believe, nearly 5 decades worth of experience working in the private and public sectors as well as in the nonprofit space. I am the founder and principal of LNC Carbon, based here in Oregon. We started this firm in 2010 to focus on forest carbon project development and forest carbon policy. And I'm also a senior fellow at the American Forest Foundation, which is based in Washington, D.C., and have assisted them to develop the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is a joint effort between the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy, really focused on the small family woodland owner component. That program is only operating now east of the Mississippi, but those of us in the West are dragging them further our way, and we hope that here in the next few years we'll be able to launch programs here on the West Coast. I'm also a small family landowner as well. Natural and working lands offer a significant and meaningful way to mitigate climate change through sustainable forest management, where we can create very resilient ecosystems. And here in the western states, forests offer the most significant and cost-effective pathway to impact carbon removal and storage. And increasingly, forest carbon projects are generating opportunities for new revenue streams for the sale of carbon offsets in the voluntary and regulated markets. Under the existing carbon registries, practice-based methodologies compensate landowners for conducting adaptive management practices that enhance carbon removal and storage, including reforestation, improved forest management, and avoided conversion from forest to non-forest land use. Now, due to the complexity and costs associated with developing and operating forest carbon projects, market participation has generally been limited to larger landowners up to this point in time. However, small family forest ownership offers a significant untapped potential to increase carbon removal and storage of resilient carbon. And we want carbon on the landscape, but we want that carbon to be resilient and be with us for a long time. And many of these properties in our states are in critical locations between urban centers and the public forests, which tend to be higher elevation. These are areas referred to as the urban-rural interface. That's where a lot of this family land ownership exists. And in addition to their ability to sequester and store carbon over time, They're important because much of the West urban drinking water flows through those landscapes. And they also are very important for wildlife corridors, which allow wildlife to move back and forth. So this panel will examine strategies to increase the accessibility of carbon markets to small forest landowners, as well as incentives designed to move more small family owners into action so these lands can contribute to achieving our state's climate mitigation goals. So with that, I'm going to ask each panelist to provide a brief introduction. Then I'm going to post a series of questions that they'll answer, and maybe we'll get a little dialogue going amongst them. And then, of course, I'll leave a little bit of time in the end to entertain some questions from the audience here. So thank you very much, and let me start with you, Danny, and have you do just a quick introduction.
Good afternoon. My name is Danny Norlander. I'm the Forest, Climate, Carbon, and Health Analyst with the Oregon Department of Forestry, and I'm very happy to be up on the stage today.
Brandon.
Hey everybody, Brandon Vickery. Happy to be here. I'm co-CEO of Finite Carbon. Finite Carbon is a forest project developer. We've been connecting forestry and carbon finance now for about 15 years. We've developed about 60 plus projects over those 15 years and generating about over 100 million credits, both in the California cap and trade compliance space and voluntary space.
My name's Andy Taylor. I'm a Senior Technical Manager of Forestry at ACR. ACR, formerly known as the American Carbon Registry, was the world's first private registry for greenhouse gas offset projects, founded in 1996. I mostly work on methodology development, so we maintain standards. We also maintain a public and transparent registry. So yeah, thanks.
Newman. I'm the Carbon Markets and Policy Specialist at Mast Reforestation. We're a post-wildfire reforestation carbon project developer helping landowners across the western states recover after their land's been burned by severe fire, as well as working to bolster the reforestation supply chain through our ownership of two nurseries, one in California, CalForest, and Silvaseed in Washington.
Great, well, thank you. See, we have a lot of expertise here up on this stage this afternoon, so we're lucky to be able to pick these folks' brains and get into a little bit of maybe down into some technical discussions around some of these issues. So the first question I want to pose to Shaw is, what are some barriers that small family forest owners face when participating in carbon offset markets?
We were going through these questions, Mast's focus being on post-fire, the sort of decision process is a little bit different for those landowners, as timber is not necessarily a present opportunity for them after they're recovering from fire. But generally sort of grouped the barriers into two categories, social barriers and economic barriers. The social barriers, reforestation, to a certain extent, IFM projects do require some level of insured permanence for those projects so that buyers and investors in those projects can be assured that those carbon stocks will remain, or that there are requirements to replant or maintain a certain level of carbon stock over, say, 100 plus years. And so in the United States, that's typically a conservation easement. Mast employs those on their projects. The social barriers, the views of conservation easements, some people are quite skeptical of them or do not want to have them on their landscape, which does then limit carbon opportunity, as well as general concerns about tying up their land over the long term, often long after we're all gone. As far as the economic barriers, there's a number of them. I know we will touch on project fees and cost of long-term MRV on this panel. Those costs are quite significant and very difficult for small forest landowners to maintain over time. Additionally, ensuring the permanence and long-term management of their land. Thinning is usually required for reforestation projects later on, and usually required within the conservation easement, and that obviously requires some funding, as well as acreage economics. Oftentimes, as we mentioned, larger landowners have lower sort of barriers to entry in this space, and small landowners have to maintain sort of these costs with a smaller revenue stream. And the last two I did want to touch on before opening it up to my fellow panelists. The price of carbon credits is obviously a big one. If you're able to, maintain $30+ a ton, that changes the economics and the sort of costs that a landowner has to carry in order to enter these markets. But, carbon credits are somewhat volatile in terms of their prices. Overseas, you often see prices around $10 a ton or less. In the US, you often see them higher, but stability and or lack of stability, I should say, of those prices is a concern for small landowners. And lastly, at least we've seen this with post-fire, they're not able to, in some states, harvest off of the land in order to recoup some of that income without triggering reforestation requirements, which of course are generally a good thing, but does then limit additionality. So their sort of decision-making process is a little bit different post-fire in that case, and can trigger some pretty high costs for them.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to call on you, Brandon. I know you have a lot of knowledge and experience because Finite's developed some methodology under ACR to help with small family landowners. So what are your thoughts about these limitations?
Yeah, well, thanks, David. The upfront costs are very significant to get a traditional forestry project off the ground. All these projects need a full carbon inventory. So that's kind of a setup as like a continuous forest inventory across the project to be revisited through the project's lifetime on a periodic basis. The measurements have to be at the tree level to inform all the various technical quantification of the carbon stocks on the project. But then they also come along with the monumentation and the documentation that's necessary for the verification body to visit the site, get back to those sample plots, and test that inventory as part of the verification. Then you have the verification part of it. So we have accredited and approved verification bodies out there that we need more of them. There's only a select few, and that's a significant capacity limitation that we see from our perspective. And they verify the project from initial development through a site visit of the inventory, and then there's desk audit work that continues through time on that verification. And so all the inventory and the verification and of course the technical expertise to get a project off the ground is very, very expensive. It's even very expensive for a large landowner. Specifically for a small landowner, it's pretty much a non-starter. So David's work with AFM through Forest Carbon Works and Finite Carbon has also developed a small non-industrial private forest land ownership methodology with ACR. That's our humble attempt to reduce those barriers. We've launched in the Southeast. It's a web-based platform where a landowner can view their property and gain some information on it and sign up for a carbon project through the project proponent that we have right now. And we're slowly making our way across up to the Northeast, and just like David said, we hope to make it out west sometime soon.
Good. So just one other quick comment, if I may add in. I'm going to wear a couple of hats. So I'm moderating, but I'm also going to make a few comments. One of the comments I would make relates to, and it was alluded to, Brandon, by you, which is the workforce management issue. For small family landowners, of which I am one, access to information, knowledge, technical assistance is really, really important. And so there's that side of the puzzle. But I would also say the other side of that puzzle is we need more education of professionals coming out of the education system that are capable of doing third-party verification. One of the limitations we see are biometricians, for example, those that help us understand how to measure trees, which then we can determine the carbon content of those trees. And so, I think there's an opportunity here to work within the university system and the local community colleges to create programs that create an opportunity to begin to fill the pipeline of qualified professionals to help us in this space. Because we are pretty new, even though I started LNC Carbon in 2010 and Finite was before me, we still are relatively new, and so we need to be funneling folks into the system that can help us get to scale. And for small family landowners, that is the real challenge, which is we have a lot of them to engage in outreach to. And if we can provide them the knowledge and some technical support, I think that'll be an important opportunity for us to think about. So Danny or Andy, do you have any thoughts you want to share? I know you work with a lot of small landowners, and so does Oregon Department of Forestry does as well. I mean, you have a whole section that deals with that.
I was just going to mention, I think David's point is spot on that, there's a lot of crossover with traditional timber-based forestry in terms of the expertise that's needed, but it's also different. And the longer the carbon market is around, and it keeps specializing and specializing, and there's just an ever-growing need for professionals committed to this. And thinking about that at the university level is a wise choice. So, yeah.
And Danny, Oregon Department of Forestry, and I know many other agencies here in the West, natural resource agencies, have programs that work to support family landowners. What are your thoughts about this?
I think that we're at kind of an inflection point where we have our more traditional technical assistance role that we have been playing, but we also have an emergence of new markets like carbon, and new concerns for small landowners, be that, more development moving into areas that there traditionally hasn't been. So the Department of Forestry works with a lot of different organizations, whether it's extension or local SWCDs and stuff. And then we also have even more recent than LNC Carbon, we have the Small Landowner Office, which was part of the Private Forest Accords, which is a historic agreement between conservation and industry that has really encouraged the department to create new rules. And part of that is that Small Landowner Office, and it's still getting its feet under it to really be able to support the smaller landowners. And I hope that we can help encourage that down the road.
Great, well, thank you. So I'm going to turn now to what we refer to as RMV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, and ask Brandon, what factors contribute to the high cost of monitoring, reporting, and verification, and what are some opportunities to reduce those costs for landowners, do you think?
Sure, yeah, I think I've kind of high-levelly summarized those upfront costs, right? So there's upfront inventory costs, it's very expensive, and getting through verification is an expensive cost, and then at the commercial terms with a technical expert such as Finite Carbon is an upfront cost. So reducing those barriers is a very difficult challenge, whether it be through a new methodology, Forest Carbon Works or Finite's core platform, leaving those aside. And then we have an aggregation of small landowners that is out there through an ACR attempt to do that through their PDA approach. But if it's a standalone small landowner, I think they can either find a project developer or some entity to underwrite the project. I think it's important to also consider the end buyers of these offset credits that get generated. The upfront costs aren't paid for until the project is developed, credits are verified, and then they're issued and ultimately retired or sold. And that could be a year and a half, 2-year process to get through. So it's a long time before that landowner potentially sees any cash revenue from their asset. Some thoughts are if perhaps there could be some bridge loan financing available to small landowners. There could be a pool of money there available that they could reach into. That would be a good thing. And continue looking at state level and federal grant opportunities that would provide some of that for them would be a great thing. Those are my initial thoughts.
Andy, I know you have some thoughts about this for sure. So.
Yeah, Brandon mentions the 1 to 2 year lead up for issuance of credits and you're kind of referring to improved forest management or IFM projects. That's, basically harvest deferral is typically what we think of, but just existing forests and increasing their sequestration potential. But that time frame is a lot longer for reforestation projects where and Shaw could speak to this better than I can, but typically it can be a decade or longer before trees are large enough to really generate credits effectively. And there's just a lot of risk and a lot of uncertainty along the way. That's particularly an area where different funding sources to kind of cover that gap would be really critical. So, and those exist to some degree, but it's a patchwork. So I don't know, Shaw, if you had other thoughts about that.
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, as Andy mentioned, with reforestation projects, especially out west, and again, we're operating kind of in the post-fire ecosystem. It can be 10 to 12 years before any sort of significant credit generation is happening on an ex-post basis, which is certainly a challenge. Oftentimes, carbon buyers, at least a lot of the ones you read about, they're not as used to investing in projects with 10 plus years, especially in the climate space, until they sort of receive the return, so to speak. However, I think we are starting to see some of that shift. There has been some movement in sort of buyer prepayment for credits, which can help landowners to finance their projects, as well as just buyers directly investing in projects. You're seeing large organizations, not to be named, based out of Seattle, that are starting to invest that way, where they are sort of directly underwriting the projects themselves and partnering with carbon project developers, using the carbon project developers' expertise to get there. And so I imagine that we'll see a continued expansion of some of that, especially in the backyards for some of these companies.
Great. One thing that I would add is, I know the state of Massachusetts, not a Western state. However, it did pass some green bonding authority by the legislature a couple of years ago now. And I think one role the state could play here is by using the faith and credit of the state to help create bonding authority to be able to generate some cash available up front that could then be paid back over time, because there is this, even for IFM projects, as Brandon indicated, it used to be when we first started over a decade ago, we could get a project through 12 to, maybe generally at 12 months or maybe even a little bit less. Today it's 18 months almost minimum, and more likely 2 years to get through the entire process. And then I'm involved in a reforestation project on my property, and we'll be lucky in 12 years. And even when we get to 12 years, there's not that much carbon there, although the growth rates are starting to kick in at that point, right? So you're going to generate some carbon over that next decade. But how do we create some bridge financing, I think, is a huge challenge, particularly for small family landowners, because there's a lot of cost up front, doesn't get repaid for a long time, and is there a way, both through private-public partnerships, that we could generate a pool of money that could be made available that gets paid back? And bonding authority is one pathway that I think the states ought to be looking at for sure. So any other thoughts or questions about MRV? Do we want to talk a little bit about new technology and what role? I know, Andy, we were going to talk about how can technology like remote sensing and other innovative approaches address some of these barriers. Do you want to dig into that a little?
Yeah, sure. So of course, to date, the carbon markets for forestry have really relied on kind of just statistical sampling, tried and true forestry practices that have been employed for since the inception of forestry as a practice, really. And remote sensing does offer this potential pathway to reduce a lot of those costs. Things can happen at greater scale with less work. Of course, it's really expensive to just send somebody out to the middle of the woods to go wrap a tree up with a tape measure, as compared to just doing some work on your computer, right? So that's kind of the crux of it. At the same time, there's a lot of specialization that goes into being able to deploy a remote sensing approach. So thinking about barriers to small landowners, it actually takes, there has to be some technical expertise to pull that off. So that's the flip side of that. But I it's already specialized enough that most landowners are not coming to the carbon market on their own terms. They have support already. So I don't really see that as a huge risk of kind of investing in these technological solutions. And just the way things are going, it feels inevitable at this point. So ACR and every other standards body and registry is really looking at ways to bring the same sort of confidence in these new solutions that we have in the existing field-based approaches. So that's something to definitely keep an eye out for. And I think within the next couple years, a couple of the programs, ACR included, will have a pretty comprehensive remote sensing approach available that will be available to all landowners. The other piece that goes along with that is aggregation too. I'm happy to talk about that.
Please, yeah.
Okay, so of course, like another potential pathway to reduce burdens for small landowners is just aggregating. And this is true for field sampling, like existing approaches as well, but basically the more land you have, the less intense you have to sample it. And that remains true in remote sensing as well. So there's a ton of operational and just logistic hurdles to aggregating a bunch of different neighbors into a single carbon project. Brandon had mentioned earlier that ACR has what we call our programmatic development approach to do just that. And Finite has been road testing that. And it's the way that Finite has organized it around a platform where landowners can kind of self-sign up is a really smart way to frame that. So that's one potential pathway here, and I think it's a really important piece. And it just, it reduces some of the costs, like verification. If you're sharing that amongst landowners, you're going to reduce those costs. So one last point on the remote sensing piece is that if it can bring even greater confidence in the end results, which we think it can, just in terms of we can know more about a forest through a remote sensing approach than we can about going out to a few select points and measuring things really carefully. There's less extrapolation going on if you're actually covering an entire forest with LiDAR data, for instance. If it can actually bring even greater confidence in the final climate benefits that a project can claim, it could also increase the value of those carbon credits such that you're reducing barriers further. So it does offer a lot of opportunity.
And just to add one thing on the remote sensing side of things, where technology at least is today for using remote sensing in sort of those initial 12 plus years of a reforestation project, at least at the very beginning, the seedlings are often way too small to be seen. And so there's still a lot of opportunity for more hybrid approaches where you are using more traditional methods, and then over time as the forest begins to grow, then you can start to layer in these remote sensing technologies to bring the credibility to those projects. But certainly there's a ton of room for continuing to use traditional methods and continuing to expand the workforce in that space.
Comment about remote sensing, which is great. I think there's no doubt we're all going in that direction, and it's going to be a really valuable tool for long-term MRV. I just don't think it's there yet. There's a lot of considerations for standardizing. I'm happy to hear ACR is looking at that. Someone like Finite Carbon or another project developer or a pure standalone company who's in a competitive marketplace to develop some of these remote sensing products, we all have to come around a common standard. They all have to get verified, so that whatever underlying methodology is in place that is used to extrapolate the conditions of the forest, and then the registries, folks like Andy, have to assess the methodology that the landowner / developer used, how it was verified, and deem it appropriate underneath the relative standards and methodologies that are in place. So there's a few more missing pieces that have to come together, but I think we're going in the right direction, and it would considerably reduce the long-term costs. These projects can go, on for many, many years, and every year, the project has to monitor and then report on the on-site carbon stocks of the forest. And if the project chooses to have those projects verified and registered and issued, then they have to go through a verification, and there's a lot of cost, long-term costs built into the project, and remote sensing can help with that.
Well, I mean, you raised a point about the third-party verification. So we're talking about project development, the project development piece, but third-party verifiers also have to verify the approach we use, which means they have to have knowledge, understanding, and access to that data as well. So, as well as the registry does, because the way carbon projects operate is we'll develop those projects, we'll put them through a third-party verification process through an accredited verifier by the registry. But then the registry does its own review as well. So there's really multiple levels of review, which means that if we're using new technology, that every step of that review process has to have the folks capable of being able to interpret and validate and verify the results that are coming out. And I would agree with you, Andy. When you take a look at remote sensing, particularly using LiDAR, which a lot of the states here in the West have flown big portions of their state with LiDAR, that's 100% census. We know every stem that's out there. But then correlating those stems to what the actual volume is, we still need on the ground. We're always going to need on the ground tools. And so using the Forest Service FIA data set, which is a really crucial piece, which we've been fighting for funding for them for years, but coupling that also with state data off each of the state's forest land base, like here in Oregon or in Washington or in California. Those data sets are critically important for us to validate the credibility of that data. But ultimately, I'm with you, Andy. I think when we move to that point, I think we should have a higher level of confidence about what those carbon numbers are. And more importantly, what we're really measuring in carbon is flux. It's the change in stocks over time. And this is where remote sensing can play a really valuable role to help us more accurately determine what the flux is of these carbon stocks over time, which is the basis of how we get paid for this carbon in the private marketplace. Danny, do you want to add anything about the role of Oregon Department of Forestry or other natural resource agencies in this remote sensing? And where are you at with the remote sensing at this point?
I think we're observing a lot right now and letting the private side lead a lot on the remote sensing side, at least. We don't necessarily have the capacity or capabilities to really be pushing that envelope right now. We do definitely utilize it. So LiDAR has been key for a lot of our different projects, whether that's looking at landslide movement or riparian corridors. But as far as like biometrics of the forest, it's not used to the degree that I think it will be in the future. So that's definitely an area that we see growth. It does take a lot of computing power and a lot of technical expertise to be able to utilize all of that. And that's one of the areas that hopefully we will be able to build with some added capacity that we've had and looking to the future.
Great, thanks.
And then one last thing on there is because of our kind of special relationship with small landowners, I think that we can serve as one of the vectors to get that kind of information to the smaller landowners, especially.
So I'm going to throw you all a curveball because we're doing good on time. We talk about remote sensing, we talk about those technologies. How will AI play out? What do you find out? You've been on the leading edge of a lot of this. Mast is clearly in the reforestation space on the leading edge of that. Where does AI play into the future in the world of carbon? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I'm not necessarily the best person at Mast to speak on it. However, I know like our GIS team and our forestry teams, Mast originally started as drone seed and has kind of pivoted over the years. But certainly there's plenty of engineering talent within the company that is starting to explore options there and how we can leverage it specifically for reforestation where we're dealing with very tiny trees.
Yeah, that would summarize my comments. I'm not an expert. It's in our radar now. We have a group of folks at Finite who are developing these remote sense approach, algorithms, machine-based learning that certainly will at some point probably incorporate some AI component within that. So AI has landed in traditional forestry.
Andy, anything from the registry's view?
We're trying to remain agnostic to the different approaches that are out there. We want to kind of define a way for all the different proprietary techniques that are out there, AI-based and using all sorts of different technologies, whether they're LiDAR or satellite. We want to define an approach for those different techniques to all verify kind of under the same rules and kind of demonstrate a minimum level of just quality. And so that's a lot of the work for the registries in the next couple of years is to work on that. The potential partnership that I could mention with public agencies on that front is just that there's the opportunity to, and this is something that the FIA unit of the U.S. Forest Service has looked at, is just kind of developing a common remote sensing database that could be used across different programs, different projects. So rather than relying on proprietary models, this would be a public-facing version of that for small landowners particularly could be a really important thing. So that's something we're advocating for at the federal level that we see big potential with.
Great, thanks. My hope is that AI will, again, we always focus on reducing costs. My experience after I've been around the planet for a while is that new technology generally doesn't reduce cost, but maybe what it can do is increase quality and speed the process, right? So I would love to see us be in a position where we're not taking 2 years to get a carbon project out the door, but it would be great that if AI and some of these other tools can speed that process, and I'm willing to pay the same amount if I can get it done in 12 months, that would be time is money, right? So as we delay in getting these credits to the marketplace, it costs us and the landowners money to do that. So if we can speed that process through this new technology, that could be like super helpful, I think. We have one more kind of formal question, and then we're going to move to an opportunity for you all to ask some questions. But Danny, this is for you. How can the state and federal agencies work to recruit or assist landowners in developing carbon offset projects?
So one of the first things that a landowner needs to do is kind of figure out what their objectives are, and that's one of the areas that we can play a role, helping them come up with what their management plans would be, helping them understand what their real goals are for their forest, for their property. That's often lacking with smaller landowners, and I think that in my experience has been really helpful to help them understand what the trade-offs are of one thing versus another and which direction they want to go. So kind of providing that training, technical assistance, and planning, even if that's down to helping them write their own management plans or figuring out if there's a contractor that can help them with that, is kind of one of the key starting points for those small landowners that we can help them with. After that, there's the technical assistance role that we play. We can help them understand what the different carbon projects can mean, who they can reach out to, things like that. And then if those aren't meeting their goals, if the carbon market isn't going to meet the goals that they want, if it isn't meeting the trade-offs that they're willing to give up, then there's alternative mechanisms that we can provide, whether that's cost share assistance to help them reach their goals, if that's carbon or if that's, you know, habitat or if that's water quality, the whole suite of things there. Kind of paired with things like wildfire risk reduction or additional harvesting. So just helping them understand what their goals are, how to get there, and then encourage them to move in the direction that they want and providing them the tools that they need to get to the point that they want. And then providing them technical assistance there. The FIA program is really key for that, at least from our point of view. So to kind of follow on to David's point on FIA, it's a national program that's very well regarded and established within the state. We have a very good working relationship with them and create various reports, whether that's the Forest Ecosystem Carbon Report that was funded by the Carbon Policy Office at the Governor's Office in 2018. I think is when we started that, finished it up in 2020, and we're going to be renewing that here in the near future with FIA. And that provides a real good baseline for what the carbon looks like throughout the forests of Oregon. And building on that, helping to really look at that into the future and how we can leverage programs like FIA to make it so that small landowners especially can understand what they have, and then extrapolate that to kind of a larger land base across the state are some of the areas that I see us as being key. So one of the things that we run into as a barrier, though, is that we're not a giant agency, and especially when it comes to those that interact with the small landowners directly. The small landowner office is definitely going to help with that, but we also have field foresters throughout the state. We have 12 different districts and roughly 55 different stewardship foresters, and they're pretty taxed. They're not only helping the small landowners and large landowners, they're ensuring compliance with the Forest Practices Act. And then in the summer, with increasing wildfire severity, we have a militia model in the department, and a lot of the times they would go off to work on fires. So we lose them for a while during the summer a lot of the time. And then they may not have quite the depth of technical knowledge that would be needed to help with carbon markets, with help understanding carbon markets and helping landowners understand carbon markets. So increasing our own internal training around that is going to be really needed. And I don't think that we're alone throughout the West on that. So it's not just training and technical support for landowners, it's also for the agency as well. And we're working on building capacity internally for how we do that training and how we get that information to our own staff even. So.
Great, thanks. I know, Andy, you ACR certainly worked at the federal level. You've mentioned that. Anything you want to add about any role that you see either state or federal agencies might be able to play here?
Well, I would even bounce this back to you or Brandon just about the role of the FIA program and some of these small landowner-specific approaches that are emerging. It's just a really key component, and the cadence of data collection in the eastern United States is kind of twice that of here in the West. It's every 5 years as opposed to every 10 years, and that's one of those big differences that's allowing those types of programs to it's part of the reason why those programs are starting out east. And so that's obviously a potential area that a higher just investment FIA program in the West could enable those programs to move out west more easily.
That's a good point. And just to put a little more context to that, in the East, the inventory plots the data is collected every 5 years, as Andy said. Here in the West, it's every 10 years. We've been working very hard to get Congress to appropriate more money for FIA. We've been somewhat successful, but trying to bring down that inventory relevance or cadence from 10 years down to 5 years, and that's a primary reason why the Family Forest Carbon Program isn't in here in the West right now, because we don't have the data necessary to be able to compare the project activity to the baseline activity, because we don't have the FIA data available to do that. It's 10 years old, and so it's a real challenge. So that's something that I think we need to work on. I guess the other comment I would make really quick here, we have the governor in the office, so I just can't help myself. But, you know, ODF does need some more help financially for sure, and I'm sure other natural resource department agencies do to get carbon ready, right? I don't need you to write it down. Just make a phone call is all we really need. But I mean, honestly, it's one of the roles that I see both the state and the federal government can play is to help get small family landowners carbon ready, if you will, right? So having tools that will allow them to have access to inventory data so they don't have to do it themselves, that can be provided through the state would be one good example. Providing the funding necessary through incentive payments to landowners to do things like right management plans, which are all required. They have to be certified, third-party certified, either through the American Tree Farm Program, the Forest Stewardship Council, or if you're a really big landowner, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. So it's these kinds of actions that the states could help play a role in getting landowners to the point where they're ready to enter the carbon market. So we get them to the doorway, and then Brandon and I will be sure we get them through the doorway, right? So and so I think that's an opportunity. But Brandon, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, all those items are great. I mean, to enroll in a improved forest management project, David's spot on. You know, having a current relevant forest management plan, and if the landowner has any intentions of doing a commercial harvesting, under most of the methodologies and protocols, they have to be certified underneath American Tree Farm or FSC or SFI. So that's often a hurdle. You know, a small landowner doesn't necessarily have the funds to launch into a full forest certification program. General knowledge, there's another like geospatial component that small forest landowners don't necessarily always have the capacity. They don't have a computer sitting in their desk with some GIS program on it. So some open source capacity to do their own mapping would be great, and then that exists out there. Maybe that comes more from Extension or Danny's work to get them carbon project ready. Project boundaries are one of the big things you guys look at, and where is this carbon project spatially defined on the earth? And if those property boundaries are in question, and they need the background and data to support their ownership, not only from a deed perspective, but from a spatial perspective, that would be a great help.
Great. Well, thank you all for those answers. So I would love to open this up to the audience to see what burning questions you may have for this group here. Yes.
Yeah, Ted Kowalski with the Walden Family Foundation. I've got two questions. One, we supported some technology, a platform.
Great, thank you.
We supported a platform called OpenET. It works with, it was jointly supported by Google and NASA and EDF and Desert Research Institute. It was primarily designed to use thermal infrared technology and satellite imagery to track like water use on fields, you know, across the US. But there have been all these other applications that are being developed, like how can we better manage our forests and how can we measure carbon as a surrogate, and wondering if you've heard of that, and if not, I'm happy to like make the connections. But then the second question is really looking for consensus among you, whether it's philanthropic dollars, private, corporate, public dollars. It seems to me like remote sensing or developing satellite imagery or LiDAR techniques is a good investment for this field in the future, but I'm just looking to see if that's consensus among these experts.
I'm going to be really bold and say I think there is consensus, and they can yell at me if there's not. But and two, I think one of the things that was brought up earlier is the notion that we need kind of a set of standards, right? So in the voluntary carbon market, we have ICVCM, right, which is we have core carbon principles that we're applying, and so we need some core principles around what's acceptable for carbon projects, relying on remote sensing. And so, I mean, Andy, maybe you have some sense of that, or Brandon, but does that seem right to you, or?
Yeah, I mean, the technology exists. It's not necessarily affordable and accessible, but it does exist. But almost what's just as important is convening just all of the actors that are interested in this field and kind of getting them to agree to a set of standards to apply to all the different approaches out there. Different technologies are going to be appropriate in different settings. So, you know, ACR's approach is to not pick and choose one particular technology to certify over any other. It's more about, like, how can we measure these equitably across different technologies and kind of judge their performance. So, and that's the challenge. Spend a lot of my time working on that, but yeah.
And I think those standards would certainly help on the verification side. You know, earlier David referenced, not only do we have to develop these remote sense products and approaches, but then ultimately it's up to a third party verifier to verify that method. And if they don't have the tools and the technology, and if they don't have a rule book to do that verification on that specific methodology, then we're still kind of disconnected.
So maybe a role between the philanthropic community and the Western Governors Association and some of the corporations that are interested in buying these offset credits, convening a roundtable on this very topic could be a very useful thing. I think this is where one thing the government has a very strong role in is convening power. And so to me, using the governors as a mechanism to create convening of interest to really hammer some of these roadblocks, I think would be quite helpful. So other questions? Okay, all the way in the very back, and then you're next after her.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Guthrie with Finite Carbon, and I have a question for Danny. The conversation today has been focused on carbon credits, which is a market-based solution to support carbon sequestration and storage, which is obviously very important. And we all know this is just one tool in our toolbox. To speed decarbonization as fast as possible, we need to use all tools at our disposal, including cost share programs, which you mentioned, and payment for practices. And these other mechanisms may very well be a better fit for some smaller forest landowners. So I was curious, does the Oregon Department of Forestry have these types of programs up and running currently, or are they under development?
Well, yes and no. So I kind of see it as a tiered system. So you have everything from the regulatory markets in California and Washington, which are very stringent and really related to developers and verifiers and things like that. And then you can kind of tier down from that. And looking to the past, we've always had cost share programs, largely not directed towards carbon or climate issues. So they have had a specific goal in play, whether that's fire risk reduction, insect risk reduction, things like that, reforestation even. And I think we're getting to the point now, and this is kind of under development as we're moving along, that at least in Oregon and other states too, we're starting to see other interests emerge more. And thanks to the legislature in the 2023 session, we had the HB 3409, which provided funds for natural working lands. We just got in the authority to start spending those funds, and we put forward, at least in forestry, and it's actually 4 different agencies working together and with the governor's office on this. So in the coming months, we'll start rolling out kind of the carbon, the climate side of things for that, and really looking forward. And all of that kind of ties into the climate change and carbon plan that the Department of Forestry developed and finalized in 2021. And that kind of sets the framework, the roadmap for where we hope to go down the road.
Great.
So yes, all of the above.
Thank you.
Chris Dambrowitz with Canada West Foundation. On the commercial forest product side, there's a move globally to provide regulatory information right down to the stand level, tracked with blockchain and et cetera. Does that path offer some opportunities around carbon data chain of custody that would actually lead to a higher focus on and higher confidence on permanence, regardless if these are conservation stands or products?
Yeah, I would say yes. Certainly, this like a stand-based inventory and tracking. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, essentially, if you've got, in order to be able to produce on a global market, you've got that track back to what level of sustainability is a forest certified with. If that's impacted by wildfire, if that's impacted by conservation, there's the ability to have that, because there's a record of that, tracking to the remote sensing.
Yeah.
It potentially gives a greater level of confidence across all of the uses of the forest.
Yes.
And I wonder if that's an opportunity to move some of the methodologies towards aligning up with those standards in order to give longer-term confidence on permanence.
Well, I would just make a quick comment. We kind of do it right now on paper, so it's not part of the blockchain, but certainly the blockchain can be incorporated into that for sure. But I think from a registry perspective, what's your view, Andy?
I kind of think of it similarly to the difference between, the sampling versus remote sensing, where, the more data you have, the better. So I think yes. And there's already a pretty rigorous system in place for tracking things back to the original sample plots. Like individual tree records are kind of maintained and monitored throughout the life of the project. That's kind of how they work. More data would probably not be a bad thing. So,
Go ahead, please.
So just one comment on that is it seems like it might help with some of the social side of things more than anything, where you're able to speak to the especially leakage, and people have concerns that if we're not harvesting as much here where we have more stringent standards, then somewhere else is just going to pick that up, and they may not have the same stringent standards that we have. If that comes to fruition and we're able to kind of show where it's coming from across the entire globe, I think it helps raise up everybody and makes it a little bit easier and more palatable to engage with carbon markets and for small and large landowners.
Well, great. We are out of time, but I would just make one final comment before thanking the panel, which currently, like ACR and all the forest certification systems, do track by lat and long, right, exactly where these projects are. So we have part of that data in place. So with the concept of being able to pull up Google Earth, if you will, and see exactly where these projects are, or see exactly where these certified forests are, and then being able to have a better sense globally of what the flux of biomass changes are occurring out there and what are the reasons for those over time, I think is where we're headed. And I think the carbon projects that are out there will fit right into that, I think. So, well, listen, thank you so much, and please join me in thanking this panel. And I'm sure we've identified some other questions that you may have, and so our contact information's available to you through WGA, and don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a short break here before we get set up for our next roundtable.